In the spring of 1944, something began to go wrong for German intelligence across occupied Europe. Radio transmissions that should have been secure were being intercepted. Supply lines were sabotaged at precisely the right moments. Safe houses were no longer safe. Orders sent from Berlin arrived at destinations that had already been destroyed. The Gestapo suspected betrayal. They were correct. But what they didn't fully understand was the scale of what they were facing. Across France, Belgium, Holland, and beyond, a network of agents was systematically dismantling the German intelligence apparatus from within. And at the heart of this network were women, 17 of them, working under code names, transmitting in cipher, building trust in a world where trust meant death if misplaced. This is not a story of superheroines. This is the story of typists, linguists, mothers, and refugees who became spies because someone had to be. Many of them would not survive the war. Some would die in concentration camps. Others would vanish into history, their contributions classified for decades. But together, in those desperate years between 1942 and 1945, they helped break Hitler's intelligence network. Not with armies. Not with technology that didn't yet exist. But with courage, intelligence, and an understanding that sometimes the only way to fight absolute evil is to walk directly into its center and lie to its face. This is how they did it. To understand what these women fought against, you need to understand what Hitler had built across Europe by 1940. It wasn't just an army. It was an intelligence system designed to control information across an entire continent. The Abwehr, German military intelligence, had agents in every occupied territory. They monitored resistance movements, tracked Allied agents, and fed information back to Berlin. The Gestapo, Hitler's secret police, operated a vast network of informants who reported on civilians suspected of disloyalty. The Sicherheitsdienst, or SD, gathered intelligence specifically for the Nazi Party, watching for threats to regime stability. These organizations didn't always cooperate smoothly. There were rivalries, bureaucratic conflicts, and competing agendas. But together they created a surveillance state that made resistance work extraordinarily dangerous. One careless word, one suspicious movement, could trigger an investigation that ended in torture and execution. The German intelligence services also controlled communications. They operated radio detection vans that could triangulate the position of illegal transmitters within minutes. Historians estimate they could locate a broadcasting agent within 15 to 20 minutes of continuous transmission in urban areas. Radio operators knew this. They called it the deadly quarter hour. German cryptographers worked constantly to break Allied codes while protecting their own. The Enigma machine, which encrypted German military communications, was considered unbreakable by most German commanders. They transmitted orders, troop movements, and intelligence assessments confident that enemy interception meant nothing without the ability to decrypt. By 1942, much of Europe lived under this system. In France, in Belgium, in Holland, in Norway, anywhere the Wehrmacht had marched, the intelligence apparatus followed. Resistance movements existed, certainly, but they were fragmented, vulnerable, and often penetrated by German agents. The Nazis seemed to know everything. The British, fighting alone after France fell in June 1940, faced a terrible problem. They needed intelligence from occupied Europe. They needed to disrupt German communications and supply lines. They needed to organize resistance movements that could support an eventual Allied invasion. But conventional military operations were impossible. The continent was held by an enemy that controlled every official channel of information. Someone proposed an unconventional solution. If you cannot send armies, send individuals. If you cannot operate openly, operate in darkness. If the enemy controls official channels, create unofficial ones. Build networks of agents who could gather intelligence, sabotage infrastructure, and organize resistance from within occupied territory itself. It was a desperate idea born of desperate circumstances, and it required people willing to parachute into enemy territory knowing they might never return. In July 1940, Prime Minister Winston Churchill issued a directive to set Europe ablaze. The Special Operations Executive, SOE, was created to carry out that mandate. It was not a conventional military organization. Its headquarters were in Baker Street in London, in offices that looked from the outside like any other wartime bureaucracy. But SOE's mission was anything but bureaucratic. They would train agents in sabotage, weapons, hand-to-hand combat, and clandestine radio operation. They would insert these agents into occupied Europe by parachute drop or small boat under cover of darkness. Once there, agents would organize local resistance fighters, gather intelligence, and conduct operations against German forces and infrastructure. It was dangerous work with a high casualty rate. Everyone involved understood this. Initially, SOE recruited primarily men. The assumption among military commanders was that espionage and sabotage required physical capabilities that women lacked. This assumption proved wrong quickly. Within months, SOE leadership recognized several advantages to recruiting women as agents. First, women could move through occupied territories with less suspicion than men. German occupying forces were overwhelmingly male and focused surveillance on military-age men who might be resistance fighters or escaped prisoners of war. A woman with proper documentation and a plausible cover story, a secretary, a nurse, a teacher, could travel and observe with fewer challenges. Second, women could serve as couriers, carrying messages and documents between resistance cells without attracting the attention that male couriers drew. The Germans had instituted forced labor conscription for men in occupied territories, meaning any man of working age on the streets during business hours needed explanation. Women working in civilian capacities provided their own explanation. Third, and perhaps most critically, women were needed as radio operators. Wireless communication was the lifeline connecting agents in the field to London. Radio operators, called pianists in the terminology of the time, transmitted intelligence reports, received instructions, coordinated supply drops, and maintained the communication networks that made organized resistance possible. It was technical work requiring training in Morse code, encryption, radio mechanics, and strict operating procedures. Women proved just as capable as men at mastering these skills. SOE established training programs and began quietly recruiting. They sought women with specific qualities: fluency in European languages, preferably native or near-native, intelligence and the ability to think quickly under pressure, emotional stability despite fear and stress, and crucially, motivation that would sustain them through the isolation and danger of solo operation behind enemy lines. Some recruits came from existing military services, women serving in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force or similar organizations who had language skills and volunteered for unspecified special duties. Others were civilians, sometimes refugees from occupied countries who wanted to fight back against the forces that had driven them from their homes. A few were already living extraordinary lives before recruitment: adventurers, athletes, women who had never quite fit conventional expectations and found in wartime an opportunity to use skills that peacetime society had no use for. The training was grueling and designed to replicate the psychological pressures of life undercover. Recruits learned to shoot pistols and operate light weapons. They practiced hand-to-hand combat techniques developed specifically for killing quietly. They studied German uniforms and rank insignia to identify high-value targets. They memorized their cover identities until they could answer questions about fictional lives without hesitation. They learned to lie convincingly under interrogation. For radio operators, the training included technical skills: operating various radio sets, performing field repairs, stringing antennas, and minimizing transmission time to avoid detection. They learned security protocols, never transmitting from the same location twice, changing frequencies on schedule, using authentication codes that would signal if they had been captured and were transmitting under duress. The mortality rate for SOE agents was approximately 25%, though for wireless operators it was higher. German radio detection capabilities meant that every transmission was a race against time. If you transmitted too long, the detection vans would triangulate your position. If you transmitted too briefly, your message might not get through. If you used the same location repeatedly, you became predictable. If you moved too frequently, you risked compromising your cover. Everyone who completed training understood these odds. They were told explicitly that if captured, they should expect torture and likely execution. The Nazis did not treat captured agents as prisoners of war entitled to Geneva Convention protections. They were classified as terrorists or spies and handled accordingly. Despite this, women volunteered. Historians still debate their motivations: patriotism certainly, hatred of Nazi occupation, desire for adventure, personal reasons that varied with each individual. What united them was the decision to go anyway, knowing the risks, accepting that they might not return. Between 1942 and 1945, SOE deployed approximately 50 women as agents into occupied France alone. Similar numbers were sent to other occupied territories. Many used code names, some assigned by SOE, others adopted from their cover identities. These code names appear in declassified documents and post-war memoirs: Madeleine, Louise, Paulette, Denise. Behind each codename was a real person with a real story. This narrative will focus on 17 of them whose operations, individually and collectively, contributed significantly to disrupting German intelligence networks in the critical years leading up to and following D-Day in June 1944. Some became famous after the war. Others remain obscure, their full stories still partially hidden in classified archives or lost entirely. But together, they represented something unprecedented, a coordinated effort by women operating at the highest levels of wartime espionage against one of history's most brutal regimes. Let me tell you about some of them. Not all 17 can be named here. Some remain classified or insufficiently documented. But these names, these lives, can stand for the others. Noor Inayat Khan was the daughter of an Indian Sufi mystic and an American mother. She grew up in Paris, studying music and writing children's stories. When Germany invaded France in 1940, she fled to Britain and volunteered for the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, where her bilingual fluency in French and English led to recruitment by SOE. She was trained as a wireless operator and given the code name Madeleine. In June 1943, Noor was parachuted into France to work as a radio operator for the Prosper Network, one of SOE's largest circuits in occupied France. She arrived at a catastrophic moment. The Prosper Network had just been compromised through a combination of German counterintelligence and unfortunate security failures. Dozens of agents were arrested within weeks of her arrival. Noor suddenly found herself one of the last functioning radio operators in the Paris region. She was ordered to return to London immediately. She refused. She understood that without radio communication, the entire resistance structure in Paris would collapse. So she stayed, knowing she was working under conditions of extreme danger, transmitting on behalf of multiple networks, moving locations constantly, carrying her radio equipment in a suitcase through German checkpoints. She lasted 3.5 months. In October 1943, she was betrayed, historians believe by a Frenchwoman who collaborated with the Germans, though accounts vary. The Gestapo arrested her, found her notebooks where she had recorded messages contrary to all security protocols, and imprisoned her. She attempted escape twice. Eventually, she was sent to Dachau concentration camp, where she was executed by a single shot to the back of the head in September 1944. She was 30 years old. Violette Sobo was a British-born woman of French descent who married a French Foreign Legion officer. When her husband was killed at El Alamein in 1942, Violette was left a widow with a young daughter. She joined SOE partly for revenge, partly out of duty. She spoke fluent French and passed training despite instructors noting that she sometimes lacked the caution necessary for clandestine work. She was brave to the point of recklessness. Her first mission in April 1944 involved assessing the state of resistance networks in Normandy ahead of the planned D-Day invasion. She completed this successfully, gathering intelligence and returning to London. Her second mission in June 1944, just after D-Day, was to coordinate resistance activities harassing German forces attempting to reinforce the Normandy front. During this second mission, her car was stopped at a German checkpoint. A firefight erupted. Violette fought alongside her French colleague until she twisted her ankle and couldn't run. She continued firing to cover his escape until she ran out of ammunition. She was captured, interrogated, and eventually sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp, where she was executed in late January or early February 1945. The exact date is uncertain. She was 23 years old. Nancy Wake was Australian by birth, a journalist who had lived in France before the war and married a wealthy French industrialist. When Germany occupied France, she worked initially as a courier for the resistance, helping Allied airmen escape to Spain. The Gestapo gave her the nickname the White Mouse because she continually evaded their attempts to capture her. By 1943, her activities had made her one of the Gestapo's most wanted individuals in France. She fled to Britain, joined SOE, and parachuted back into France in April 1944 as part of preparations for D-Day. She worked as a liaison between SOE and Marquis resistance groups in the Auvergne region, coordinating weapons drops and organizing guerrilla operations against German forces. Nancy Wake survived the war, one of the few whose story ended not in capture and execution but in survival and old age. She lived until 2011, dying in London at age 98. After the war, she learned that her French husband had been arrested by the Gestapo in 1943, tortured for information about her whereabouts, and executed when he refused to talk. She never remarried. Christine Granville, born Christina Skarbek in Poland, was perhaps the most remarkable of them all, though her story is less known because much of her work was classified for decades after the war. She was a Polish countess who became one of SO's longest-serving agents, working from 1939 until the end of the war. She operated first in Poland and Hungary, gathering intelligence and helping establish escape routes. Later she worked in France, where she became legendary for her resourcefulness and courage. In one documented incident in August 1944, she learned that 2 French resistance leaders and a fellow SOE agent had been captured by the Gestapo and were scheduled for execution. She walked into Gestapo headquarters, identified herself as a niece of British General Bernard Montgomery, a complete fabrication, and informed the Germans that Allied forces were hours away and that she would personally ensure that anyone involved in executing the prisoners would face war crimes charges. The bluff worked. The Gestapo officers, sensing the war was ending and fearing post-war prosecution, released the prisoners. Christine escorted them out of Gestapo headquarters. This story sounds like fiction but is documented in declassified SOE files. Christine survived the war but was murdered in London in 1952 by a rejected suitor, stabbed to death in the lobby of a cheap hotel. She was 44 years old. Britain awarded her the George Medal and the OBE for her wartime service, but she died in poverty, her contributions largely forgotten. These 4, Noor, Violette, Nancy, and Christine, are among the better documented cases. But there were others whose names appear in fragments of declassified files and post-war research. Pearl Witherington, who parachuted into France in September 1943 and eventually commanded a resistance network of over 1,500 fighters, conducting sabotage operations that delayed German troop movements toward Normandy after D-Day. Yvonne Cormeau, who operated as a radio operator in southwestern France for over 13 months, transmitting more than 400 messages despite constant danger of detection. Odette Sansom, who was captured in April 1943, tortured by the Gestapo, her toenails were pulled out, her back was burned with a hot iron, and survived to testify at war crimes trials after the war. Lise de Baysac, who worked undercover in France for 2 years, moving constantly, organizing supply drops and reconnaissance missions. André Borel, one of the first female agents parachuted into France, who worked organizing sabotage operations until her arrest in June 1943. She was executed at Natzweiler-Struthof concentration camp in July 1944. And others, Denise Bloch, Madeleine Desmament, Eliane Pluman, Cecil Leffert, Diana Roden, Vera Lee, Yolanda Beekman, women whose code names appear in operational reports, whose missions contributed to the larger work of resistance, and who died in concentration camps or in Gestapo cellars. Some of their stories are well documented. Others remain fragmentary, known only through brief mentions in archives or testimonies of survivors. Together, these 17 and the others whose names we know and those we don't, they formed a network that operated across occupied Europe, gathering intelligence, coordinating resistance, and systematically disrupting German control of information and communication. The work these women did was technical, dangerous, and often tedious. Espionage in reality bears little resemblance to its fictional portrayals. It involves waiting, watching, and repeating small actions that individually seem insignificant but collectively create results. Radio operators like Nuranayat Khan and Yvonne Cormeau spent hours each day transmitting intelligence reports to London and receiving instructions. These transmissions had to be encrypted using cipher systems that required careful attention. One error in encryption could render a message unreadable or, worse, comprehensible to German cryptanalysts who intercepted it. Every transmission was a calculated risk. The radio operator would select a location, an apartment, a barn, a field, and set up the radio equipment, stringing an antenna and connecting the power source. She would encode her message, then begin transmitting in Morse code, listening through headphones for London's response while watching the clock. 15 minutes was generally considered the maximum safe transmission time before German direction-finding vans could triangulate the position. If the transmission ran long, the operator had to make a decision: cut it short and risk incomplete communication, or continue and risk detection. If she heard vehicles approaching or spotted suspicious activity, she had to shut down immediately, dismantle the equipment, hide it, and leave. The next transmission would come from a different location at a different scheduled time. The intelligence gathered and transmitted by these networks was extensive and valuable. They reported on German troop movements, identified military installations, assessed morale among occupation forces, and provided targeting information for Allied bombing raids. After D-Day in June 1944, their reports on German reinforcement movements toward Normandy allowed Allied air forces to interdict these forces effectively, significantly disrupting German defensive responses. Sabotage operations were another critical element. While women agents sometimes participated directly in sabotage, their primary role was often organizational, coordinating local resistance fighters, arranging weapons drops from London, identifying targets, and planning operations that others would execute. One documented operation involved Pearl Witherington's network in central France. In the weeks following D-Day, her fighters conducted repeated ambushes and sabotage operations against German forces attempting to move north toward the invasion beaches. They cut railway lines, mined roads, ambushed convoys, and generally made movement dangerous and slow for German units. These operations were small individually, a few hundred resistance fighters against units of the Wehrmacht, but their cumulative effect was significant. German divisions that should have reached Normandy within days took weeks, arriving depleted and exhausted, having fought hundreds of small engagements along the way. The intelligence work also involved building and maintaining networks of informants, ordinary French, Belgian, Dutch, and other citizens who provided information about German activities. A railway worker might note troop trains passing through. A clerk in a local government office might provide copies of German orders. A farmer might report new construction at a nearby military facility. These fragments of information, collected and transmitted to London, combined with similar reports from dozens of other sources to create an intelligence picture that Allied commanders used for planning operations. Maintaining these networks required constant personal contact, which meant risk. Every meeting could be a trap. Every new informant could be a German agent. Trust had to be established and constantly verified. Security protocols required that networks be compartmentalized, individual cells that didn't know about other cells, so that if one was compromised, the damage would be limited. But this compartmentalization made coordination difficult and placed enormous pressure on the agents who served as liaisons between cells and with London. The breaking of German intelligence networks happened not through single dramatic operations but through this steady accumulation of pressure. Radio operators transmitted despite danger of detection. Saboteurs destroyed communications infrastructure. Intelligence networks identified German agents and facilities. Gradually, the Germans' ability to control information across occupied Europe deteriorated. German intelligence services recognized they had a problem but struggled to address it effectively. They increased security measures, conducted sweeps for illegal transmitters, infiltrated resistance groups, and arrested suspected agents. These measures had some success. As we will see, many agents were captured, but they could not stem the overall flow of intelligence to London or prevent the coordination of resistance activities that accelerated as Allied invasion approached. The fundamental issue for German intelligence was that occupied territories required cooperation from local populations to administer. The Nazi regime's brutality, mass executions, forced labor, systematic looting, deportations, alienated those populations and created vast numbers of people willing to resist. The intelligence networks that SOE agents helped organize tapped into this reservoir of resentment and channeled it into effective action. By 1944, German commanders in France admitted in their reports that they had largely lost control of intelligence in rural areas. They could secure cities and major roads with military force, but the countryside was increasingly hostile territory where their movements were observed and reported, where their communications could be ambushed, where they operated essentially blind. This was the achievement these 17 women and their colleagues contributed to, not individually defeating the German war machine, but creating conditions that made effective German operations increasingly difficult while facilitating Allied planning and operations. When D-Day came in June 1944, the success of the invasion depended not just on the forces landing on the beaches but on the infrastructure of intelligence and sabotage that had been built over the preceding years, to which these women's work was essential. The casualty rate among SOE agents was staggering. Of the approximately 50 women deployed to France, 15 were captured and did not survive. The fates they met were documented in post-war trials and investigations. Noor Inayat Khan, as mentioned, was betrayed in October 1943. After her capture, the Gestapo found her notebooks containing plaintext copies of messages she had sent and received, a catastrophic security failure, though one born of her desperate situation trying to maintain communications for multiple compromised networks. The Germans used this information and attempted to use her radio set to send false messages to London in what was called a playback operation. London suspected the deception. Noor's security checks, deliberate errors that agents included in messages to prove they were transmitting freely, were missing from the messages received after her capture. SOE knew or strongly suspected that Madeleine's radio had been compromised but continued to communicate, feeding false information back to the Germans while avoiding real intelligence exposure. It was cold calculation, using Knorr's capture as an opportunity for counterintelligence. Knorr was held for nearly a year before her execution. During that time, she attempted escape twice and reportedly suffered harsh treatment. She was eventually classified as a highly dangerous prisoner and transferred to Dachau, where on September 13, 1944, she was shot. According to testimony from a survivor, her last word was "Libet." Violette Sobo's capture in June 1944 followed the firefight at a German roadblock. She was interrogated at Gestapo headquarters in Paris, then transferred to Fresnes prison and later to Germany. At Ravensbrück concentration camp, she was held with two other female SOE agents, Denise Bloch and Lillian Rolfe. All three were executed together, shot in the back of the head or neck, though the exact date remains uncertain, sometime between late January and early February 1945, just months before the camp's liberation. The circumstances of these executions were documented in post-war testimony from Ravensbrück survivors. The women were kept in separate cells, brought out individually for execution. They showed no panic. One survivor testified that Violette remained calm and tried to comfort the German guard who had to escort her, telling him it wasn't his fault. André Borel, one of the first female agents dropped into France, was arrested in June 1943 when the Prosper network collapsed. She was held in Fresnes prison, then transferred to Germany. In July 1944, she and three other female SOE agents, Diana Roden, Vera Lee, and Sonia Olshanesky, were taken from Karlsruhe prison to Natzweiler Struthof concentration camp in Alsace. What happened there was documented in post-war testimony. The four women were told they would receive typhus inoculations. Instead, they were injected with phenol, a poison. When the injections didn't kill them quickly enough, they were thrown alive into the camp crematorium furnace. A prisoner who worked at the crematorium testified to this after the war. The camp commandant was later tried and executed for war crimes. These deaths were not aberrations. The Nazi regime had decided that captured agents, particularly female agents, were to be executed under the Nacht und Nebel decree, night and fog, which specified that resistance fighters should disappear without trace to create terror and uncertainty. The intent was that families would never know what happened to their relatives, that the uncertainty would be psychologically devastating to resistance movements. It succeeded in creating terror. It did not succeed in stopping resistance. For every agent captured, others continued operations. For every network compromised, new networks formed. The women who continued working after learning of their colleagues' arrests did so with full knowledge of what capture meant. They continued anyway. The psychological burden this placed on surviving agents was immense. Pearl Witherington, who survived the war, later spoke about the constant fear that became background noise to daily existence. Fear of the knock on the door, fear of the stranger who might be a German agent, fear that every transmission would be the one that got you caught. You learned to function despite fear because the alternative was paralysis and failure. Nancy Wake, interviewed decades after the war, said she dealt with fear by staying constantly busy, by focusing on immediate tasks and not allowing herself to think about what might happen if things went wrong. When asked if she had nightmares about her wartime experiences, she replied that she had nightmares about what would have happened if she hadn't fought, if the Nazis had won, if resistance had failed, if courage had not been found when it was needed. Not all captured agents were executed immediately. Some, like Odette Sansom, survived years of imprisonment and torture. Odette was arrested in April 1943 along with her SOE colleague and circuit leader Peter Churchill. During interrogation, she was tortured repeatedly. The Gestapo pulled out her toenails and burned her back with a hot iron trying to extract information about other agents. She revealed nothing. She protected her circuit and her colleagues through months of torture and solitary confinement. She was eventually sent to Ravensbrück, where she was held until the war's end. She survived partly through extraordinary resilience and partly through a strategic deception. She convinced the Germans that she was related to Winston Churchill. She was not, though her colleague Peter Churchill coincidentally shared the Prime Minister's surname. The Germans, believing she might be valuable as a hostage, kept her alive. When Ravensbrück was liberated in April 1945, Odette was found in the camp's punishment block, emaciated and traumatized but alive. She returned to Britain and testified at war crimes trials. She received the George Cross, Britain's highest civilian award for gallantry. She wrote a memoir and became one of the more public faces of SOE's female agents in the post-war years. But even survival carried costs. Many survivors struggled with what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares, struggled with relationships, found civilian life difficult after years operating in situations of constant danger. Some, like Christine Granville, found peacetime society had little use for their extraordinary wartime skills and lived in relative poverty despite their service. Church bells ringing. Victory celebrations. Then quiet, archives being opened, medals being presented to families of the dead. When the war ended in May 1945, the full scope of SO's operations and casualties began to be understood. Investigations were launched to determine what had happened to missing agents. Testimony was gathered from concentration camp survivors. German records were examined. Slowly, incomplete stories were reconstructed. The British government awarded decorations to many of the women agents. Odette Sansom received the George Cross. Violette Sobo and Noor Inayat Khan were both posthumously awarded the George Cross as well. At the time, women were not eligible for the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military decoration, so the George Cross was the highest honour available. Nancy Wake received multiple decorations from Britain, France, and the United States. But recognition was complicated. SOE had operated in legal and moral grey areas. Some of its operations violated international law regarding warfare. The organisation had cooperated with resistance movements that the post-war French government viewed with suspicion, communist resistance groups, in particular, which had been effective during the war but were now seen as potential threats to political stability. There were debates about whether SOE had been effective, or whether its operations had provoked German reprisals against civilian populations that cost more lives than the military benefit justified. SOE itself was dissolved in January 1946. Its records were classified. The full stories of its operations would remain hidden for decades. Some files were deliberately destroyed. Others were sealed for 50 or 75 years. The agents themselves were often forbidden to discuss their wartime work, bound by the Official Secrets Act. This meant that for many years, the contributions of these women remained unknown outside narrow circles. Christine Granville's murder in 1952 was reported in British newspapers, but her wartime record was barely mentioned because it was still classified. When Nancy Wake returned to Australia after the war, few people knew what she had done. Even their families often didn't know the details. Children grew up knowing their mothers had done something important in the war but not what specifically. The situation began to change in the 1960s and 1970s as SOE files started to be declassified. Historians gained access to operational records, casualty reports, and agent personnel files. Memoirs were published by surviving agents who were finally permitted to discuss their experiences. The full scope of SO's work and the extraordinary contributions of its female agents became documented historical fact rather than classified secret. In 1995, the British government erected a memorial in Westminster Abbey honouring the 14 women of SOE who died on active service, 13 deployed to France, 1 to Holland. Their names were inscribed: Denise Bloch, Andre Borrell, Madeleine Desmament, Noor Inayat Khan, Cecil Leffert, Vera Lee, Eliane Pluman, Lillian Rolfe, Diana Roden, Yvonne Rudlat, Sonia Olshanesky, Violette Sobo, and Odette Hallows, Sansom, who survived but whose colleagues did not. The memorial service was attended by surviving agents, now elderly women, and by families of those who had died. Queen Elizabeth II was present. It was formal recognition, decades delayed, of sacrifice that had occurred half a century earlier. Similar memorials and honours have been established in France and other countries where these women operated. Noor Inayat Khan has a statue in London near her childhood home, unveiled in 2012, the first memorial to an Asian woman in Britain. Violette Sobo's story inspired a film, Carve Her Name with Pride, released in 1958, though like most biographical films it took significant dramatic liberties with actual events. The question of what they actually accomplished, whether their sacrifice was strategically justified, is debated by historians. Some argue that SO's impact was limited, that resistance operations were too small-scale to significantly affect German military capabilities, and that the intelligence gathered by other means, particularly ultra-decrypts of German Enigma transmissions, was more valuable. Others argue that SO's contribution was substantial, particularly in France where resistance activities disrupted German responses to D-Day and provided intelligence that couldn't be obtained through signals intelligence alone. The fact that German commanders reported losing control of intelligence in occupied territories suggests that SO's networks were having real effects. What seems clear from declassified records is that the work these women did contributed to a larger Allied effort that ultimately succeeded. They were not individually decisive. No single agent changed the war's outcome. But collectively, as part of SO's broader operations and as part of the even broader Allied strategy, their contributions mattered. Intelligence they transmitted was used in planning operations. Sabotage they organized disrupted German logistics. Networks they maintained provided support for the eventual liberation of occupied territories. And their presence, their existence as women performing these roles, challenged assumptions about women's capabilities that had been entrenched in military culture for centuries. After the war, when debates continued about women's roles in armed forces, the record of SO's female agents provided evidence that women could operate effectively in the most demanding combat-adjacent roles. This didn't immediately change policies. Many countries, including Britain and the United States, continued excluding women from combat positions for decades, but it planted seeds of evidence that would eventually support policy changes. If you visit Ravensbrück today, it's a memorial site maintained by the German government. The crematorium still stands. The cells where prisoners were held remain preserved. There are plaques listing names of those who died there, including the names of Violette Sobo, Denise Bloch, and Lillian Rolf. It's a quiet place now, surrounded by forest in what is now northeastern Germany. Visitors walk slowly, speaking in whispers if they speak at all. It's difficult to imagine the horror that occurred there, difficult to reconcile the peaceful present with the documented past. But the names on the plaques insist on memory. Violette Sobo, who fought at a roadblock until she ran out of ammunition. Noor Inayat Khan, who refused evacuation to maintain radio communications. Christine Granville, who walked into Gestapo headquarters and bluffed her way out with prisoners. André Borrell, who organized sabotage networks until betrayal. And the others, the 17 and more whose stories we've touched on here. They were not superheroes. They were women who found themselves in impossible circumstances and chose to fight rather than accept what they were told was inevitable. They made that choice knowing the likely cost. Many paid it. When we ask what ordinary people can do against systems of absolute power, against regimes that seem undefeatable, their answer is written in declassified files and concentration camp records. Not much, perhaps, measured individually. But enough, measured collectively, to matter. The 17 women this story focuses on, and the dozens more who worked alongside them, did not defeat Nazi Germany alone. They were part of a vast Allied effort involving millions of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and civilians. The factories producing tanks and aircraft, the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, the soldiers landing on Normandy beaches, all were necessary. None were sufficient alone. But within that vast effort, these women found places where individual courage and intelligence could make specific, measurable differences. A radio transmission that reached London informed bomber targeting that destroyed a railway junction that delayed German reinforcements that saved Allied lives. A sabotage operation that cut a communications line prevented a German headquarters from coordinating defenses effectively during a critical engagement. An intelligence report about German troop dispositions allowed Allied commanders to exploit weaknesses they would otherwise not have known existed. These effects cascade. They're difficult to quantify precisely. Military historians still debate the exact impact of various resistance operations, but the cumulative effect was real. German commanders documented their loss of intelligence control in occupied territories. They complained in reports about the effectiveness of partisan operations. They diverted troops and resources to re-area security that might otherwise have been used at the front. And beyond the tactical and strategic impacts, there was a moral dimension. The Nazi regime claimed that resistance was futile, that their control was absolute, that collaboration was the only rational choice. Every act of resistance contradicted that claim. Every agent who parachuted into occupied territory, every message transmitted despite danger, every sabotage operation successfully executed, each one proved that the Nazi claim of invincibility was false. The people living under occupation needed to see that proof. They needed to know that resistance was possible, that they were not abandoned, that the war could still be won. The BBC broadcasts from London, the supply drops of weapons, the presence of Allied agents organizing resistance, these demonstrated that occupied Europe had not been forgotten, that the fight continued, that eventual liberation remained possible. Many of the women agents understood this aspect of their mission explicitly. They spoke afterward about the importance of maintaining hope, of proving that the occupiers were not all-powerful, of organizing scattered resistance into effective action. Their presence mattered symbolically as much as operationally. The last surviving members of this generation are gone now. Nancy Wake, who lived until 2011, was among the last. She gave interviews in her final years, speaking with remarkable clarity about events 7 decades past. She talked about fear and courage, about the friends who didn't come back, about the necessity of fighting even when the odds seemed impossible. In one interview, conducted when she was in her 90s, she was asked if she had regrets about her wartime actions. She thought for a moment, then said no. She regretted the necessity, regretted that Hitler had created a situation where such things were necessary, but not her choice to fight. Given the same circumstances again, she said, she would make the same decision. That seems to be the common thread among survivors who spoke about their experiences. Not pride exactly, though some felt proud of what they'd accomplished. Not pleasure in the violence and danger they'd experienced, but a quiet certainty that they had done what circumstances demanded, that refusing to act would have been worse than accepting the risks of action. Odette Sansom, interviewed decades after her torture and imprisonment, said something similar. She was asked how she had endured, how she had survived torture without breaking. She said she had simply decided that she would not betray her colleagues, that this was a decision she made once and then maintained regardless of pain. She said it wasn't heroism, it was just stubbornness, refusal to give her interrogators what they wanted. But that stubbornness, maintained through months of torture, saved lives. The agents she didn't betray continued operating because she endured. Today, the roles these women pioneered are no longer exceptional. Women serve in military intelligence roles, in special operations, in combat positions across the armed forces of many nations. The barriers that made their service unusual in the 1940s have largely fallen, though debates about women in combat continue in some contexts. But the 17 women of this story didn't fight for future policy changes. They fought because their countries were at war, because Nazi Germany threatened everything they valued, because someone had to do the work and they were capable of doing it. The fact that their service eventually contributed to expanded opportunities for future generations of women in military service was a side effect, not their primary motivation. Their primary motivation was simpler and more immediate: stop the Germans from winning the war, gather intelligence that will save Allied lives, coordinate resistance that will disrupt enemy operations, maintain communications that will allow liberation to be planned and executed, survive if possible, but complete the mission regardless. This is not the language of heroic mythology. It's the language of professional soldiers doing difficult, dangerous work because it needs to be done. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson of their stories. Heroism in reality is not dramatic moments of individual glory but sustained performance of difficult duty despite fear and exhaustion and the knowledge that you might not survive to see the outcome of your work. Noor Inayat Khan transmitting in Paris for 3.5 months while the Gestapo hunted her. Violette Sobo fighting at a roadblock to cover her colleague's escape. Christine Granville maintaining her cover through years of operations across multiple countries. Pearl Witherington commanding 1,500 resistance fighters in sabotage operations. Yvonne Cormeau transmitting 400 messages over 13 months. These were sustained efforts requiring daily courage, not single moments of dramatic action. The files on these women, once classified for decades, are now mostly available in archives. Researchers can read the operational reports, the training assessments, the post-mission debriefings. They can trace the networks these agents built, the intelligence they gathered, the operations they organized. They can read German documents that show the impact of Allied intelligence and sabotage operations on Wehrmacht effectiveness. What the files cannot fully convey is the human experience behind the operational language. The fear of every transmission. The exhaustion of living under false identity for months or years. The moral weight of organizing operations where people would die. The trauma of torture and imprisonment. The grief of learning that colleagues had been captured and executed. The difficulty of returning to civilian life after years of living at extreme intensity. Some survivors wrote memoirs attempting to convey these experiences. Some gave interviews. But language struggles to capture the reality of sustained mortal danger, of functioning despite terror, of making life-and-death decisions with incomplete information under extreme pressure. The experiences exist beyond the words used to describe them. What we can know with certainty is what they did and what it cost. We can know that they volunteered for work with approximately 25% mortality rates. We can know that 15 of the 50 women sent to France did not survive, that most of those 15 were executed in concentration camps. We can know that their work contributed to Allied victory and to the liberation of occupied Europe. We can know that their courage was real, their sacrifice was real, and the necessity that demanded such sacrifice was real. There's a danger in stories like this one, the danger of making war seem noble or necessary, of romanticizing violence, of suggesting that extraordinary circumstances justify what would otherwise be inexcusable. These 17 women killed people, organized operations where people died, participated in a war that consumed millions of lives across 6 years of industrialized slaughter. The context matters. They fought against a regime that was conducting genocide, that had invaded their countries, that explicitly aimed for the subjugation or extermination of entire populations. The necessity of resisting Nazi Germany seems clear in retrospect. But even necessary wars destroy lives, damage survivors, and create trauma that echoes through generations. So we remember these women not to glorify war but to honor specific individuals who confronted impossible circumstances with courage and paid terrible prices for doing so. We remember that Noor Inayat Khan wanted to write children's stories, not kill German soldiers. That Violette Sobo wanted to raise her daughter in peace, not die in a concentration camp at 23. That Christine Granville wanted to live in her beloved Poland, not become a spy wandering Europe under false names. That all of them would have preferred lives that never required the choices they made. But Hitler invaded Poland, France, the Low Countries, Norway, the Soviet Union. The Nazi regime committed atrocities that made resistance not just justified but morally necessary. And when resistance became necessary, these women were among those who stepped forward to provide it, knowing the likely cost, accepting it anyway. That is the story. Not simple heroism, but complex courage. Not victory without cost, but survival purchased at terrible price. Not individuals changing history alone, but specific people making specific contributions to collective efforts that eventually succeeded. Their names are inscribed on memorials now. Noor Inayat Khan, Violette Sobo, Nancy Wake, Christine Granville, Andre Borrell, Pearl Witherington, Odette Sansom, Yvonne Cormo, and the others, Denise Bloch, Madeleine Desmament, Eliane Pluman, Cecil Leffert, Diana Roden, Vera Lee, Lillian Rolfe, Yolanda Beekman, Sonia Olshanesky. Say their names. Read their stories in the archives that are now open. Visit the memorials where they are honored. Remember that they were real people who lived real lives that were cut short or forever changed by war. Remember that courage is not absence of fear but action despite it. Remember that ordinary people, when circumstances demand, sometimes do extraordinary things. And remember, perhaps most importantly, that the necessity for such courage should never arise again. That the world they fought to free from Nazi tyranny should be one where no future generation faces similar choices. That their sacrifice should inspire not admiration of war but commitment to the hard work of preventing it. They broke Hitler's intelligence network not because they were superheroes but because they were willing to work with meticulous care at dangerous tasks, to persist despite fear and loss, to maintain faith that their efforts mattered even when the outcome remained uncertain. That willingness, multiplied across thousands of Allied agents and millions of resistance fighters and hundreds of millions of civilians who refused to accept Nazi control, that collective willingness broke the Third Reich more surely than any single battle or strategic decision. This was their contribution. This is their legacy. Not perfection, but persistence. Not fearlessness, but courage. Not individual glory, but collective resistance that, eventually, after terrible cost, succeeded. The 17 women who broke Hitler's intelligence network did not do so alone, did not do so completely, and did not do so without paying prices that haunted survivors and ended 15 lives in ways that should not be forgotten or sanitized. They were part of a vast struggle involving millions of people. But within that vast struggle, in the specific ways available to them, they fought effectively against one of history's most evil regimes. That is enough. It has to be enough. Because it is all we have, the historical record, the declassified files, the memorials, the memories of a generation now gone. We cannot ask them anymore what it was like, what they felt, whether it was worth it. We can only read what they left behind, what others testified about them, what the archives preserve. And we can remember. Not with simplified hero worship. Not with nationalist propaganda. Not with the distortions that time and ideology impose on historical truth. But with honest acknowledgement of what they did, why they did it, what it cost them, and what their example still teaches about human capacity for courage when courage becomes necessary. They did not want to be heroes. They wanted to survive, to defeat the enemy, to return home. Most did not achieve all of those goals. Many achieved none. But all of them tried. All of them, in the ways available to them, fought back against darkness. That fight mattered then. The memory of it matters now. This is their story. Imperfect, incomplete, but true to what the evidence reveals. 17 women among millions who resisted Nazi occupation. Their names preserved. Their courage documented. Their sacrifice remembered. May we never need such courage again. But if we do, may we find it.